Hi there. So welcome to Lesson 2, Video 2, Elements of a Happy Sentence, Part 2, a continuation of the slides from last week. Let's get started. So we left off last time in the middle of this long element of agreement. Remember, these elements are just categories of smaller rules. And last time we covered consistency in pronoun, consistency in tense, and seesaw conjunctions. And this week we're going to begin by continuing with more forms of agreement. Just a note, agreement is by far the longest element, so there's a lot of stuff within it. So consistency in number. Number is an inherent property of all nouns and verbs. They can be either singular or plural. It's pretty intuitive. So singular, it refers to one thing. Plural, it refers to many things. Every noun and verb and pronoun has an inherent number. And just a note about an odd reality in English, the singular form of a present tense verb usually ends with S, but the plural form doesn't. So in contrast to nouns where we add an S for the plural form, in English, not in English, for verbs, you add an S to the singular form. So it's a little bit weird. Then consistency in number. This is why we care about number, because the SAT tests on consistency in number. There are two forms of this. The first is subject-verb agreement. Subject and verb have to have the same number. The second is noun-pronoun agreement. When you use a pronoun to refer back to a noun, noun and the pronoun have to have the same number. If you don't, you destroy agreement and your sentences are sad. So an example here, in the same format we've been looking at, we has eaten at this restaurant 100 times. Just a reminder, you should pause and ask your class, what's wrong with this? What's wrong here is that the number of we and has does not match up. We is a plural pronoun, has is a singular verb. Not good. You can fix it by changing has to have, and now both we and have are plural. All right. Then the next two topics are sort of subtopics of consistency in tense. There are these tricky sort of things with tense that the SAT will test on. There's a caution here, because you have to be careful, because students often get tripped up by this. So the first one is called the collective singular, and a collective singular noun is a noun that refers to a single group of many objects or entities. So it's a single group, so it grammatically behaves as a singular noun, but it refers to many objects or entities, so it sounds like or feels like it should be conjugated plurally, but I don't know if conjugated plurally makes any sense. It sounds like it should be plural, but it's not, it's singular. So some common examples are family, team, and class. All of these refer to like a group of many individuals, but it's a single group. A team is a singular thing, and so you have to treat team or family or class. There's 30 or 50 other examples in English. You have to treat all of these words as singular nouns. So an example. This is tricky, so I encourage you to take a moment, even pause the video, and think about which of these are correct. Okay, let's reveal the answers. Only the final one. Let's look at what's wrong. First, the school faculty have a luncheon every year. No. Faculty is a collective singular noun, so it's singular. Have is plural. So even though this sounds like it could be right in English, school faculty have a luncheon, yeah, we would say that. Grammatically, it's not correct. We need to change this to has. Then down here, my family does not like Disneyland because we cry whenever we go there. That is very sad, and it's even more sad because this sentence is grammatically incorrect. Family is a collective singular noun. It's singular. We is a plural pronoun. You can't pair a plural pronoun with a singular noun. So we could change this Technically, the right pronoun for family is it, because family is a non-human singular entity, but it sounds weird to say my family does not like Disneyland because it cries. I mean, the family doesn't cry, it's the members. So I think a better way to revise this would just be to say my family members do not like Disneyland because we cry whenever we go there. Now family members is plural and we is plural. Then third, LeBron James was upset that his team didn't win the game, but they did try very hard, and that's what matters. Indeed. So here again, it's the same problem. Team is a collective singular noun. They is a plural pronoun. Sounds correct, not actually correct. We can change it to LeBron was upset that his team didn't win the game, but his teammates did try very hard. So that would be better. There are other ways to revise it that I'm sure you could think of. And down here we have one that's correct, similar to what I just said. All of the teammates, which is plural, were, which is plural, proud of their, which is plural, performance last night. Correct. Then indefinite pronouns. This is another tricky sort of sub-rule or sub-case of consistency in tense. Again, use caution here. An indefinite pronoun is a pronoun that refers to a non-specific broad category of objects or entities. That's sort of vague and not really important. What's important is that there's these certain classes of words that, again, sound like they're plural, but are actually singular. That's first, any word that ends in one body or thing, like everybody. Doesn't everybody refer to many people? Yeah, but it's a singular word. And also either, neither, each, and every. Those are all singular indefinite pronouns. Here's some common indefinite pronouns for you and your students to peruse. And here's an SAT-style practice question. So after the concert concluded, everybody was walking back to their car. It sure sounds fine, but it's technically not grammatically correct. Correct fix should be switching it with his or her. And let's walk through each of these answers. There is incorrect because everybody is, again, a singular indefinite pronoun. There is plural, doesn't work. His or her, that's singular. Everybody's singular, it works. Its is singular, but everybody refers to humans. We don't usually use it for humans. That doesn't really work. And many creates a whole new problem because you don't say many car. Car is singular. It needs a singular modifier. That doesn't work. It just creates a whole new set of problems. Also, I want to show you something rather interesting. If you exit out of present mode and you look at edit mode, you will see that this doesn't quite look right. Like this doesn't align at all. And you might be tempted to, move it and make it so that it aligns perfectly. There we go. And then if you do that, you'll go back to present mode and suddenly it won't align anymore. So I don't know why this is happening. I think it has to do with the fact that I originally created these slides in PowerPoint and then imported them here. But even if I create new slides and completely redo the formatting, this still happens. So I don't know why it's happening, but it is happening. So I've actually spent a long time carefully trying to position on certain slides only, trying to position the various sort of text boxes in a way where it will appear correctly in presentation mode, because that's how you'll present it to students. So it's going to look wrong in edit mode, but it will be right in present mode. So if we go back to present mode, now that I've messed things up again, they're fixed again. That's not quite perfect. Down a little bit. There we go. Beautiful. Yeah, so just keep that in mind in case you decide to change any of the slides. Some of the formatting's a little bit weird. All right, look, it is our old friend, the purple slide. And remember, a purple slide means that this is non-essential 1600 material. It's things you should not be emphasizing in class, things that maybe appear on the SAT in one question on any given exam. And for this lesson in particular, it might be a good idea to just not present the purple slides at all. Just sort of eliminate them and put them into a separate slide deck and post that online for students to reference afterward. You're welcome to present them. As I said last week, it's your choice. But if you do present them, make sure not to spend too long on them, because this lesson is already very jam-packed with information. The required slides alone are going to take a long time, and you don't want to spend a long time going through the details of these purple slides and then run out of time for the games or the required material. So if you do go through it just briefly, tell students this is just a little taste and that they can read more about it if they're confused. That being said, on the videos, I will go through the purple slides so that you understand them. Regardless of whether you choose to present this material or not, you yourself should be familiar with it. One, because students might review it on their own and then ask you questions next week, and you have to know the material. And second, this material will still sometimes slip into a question in a homework assignment or classwork assignment, because, as I said, these purple concepts will appear in maybe one question. And so you need to know how to answer those questions if they do arise. All right, that was a long explanation about these purple slides. Let's jump back in with articles. So articles. Articles sound simple. They're a, an, and the. There's little words that you probably don't really even think about using. But if you start to dissect when and how you're supposed to use them in a grammatically correct manner, it gets sort of complex. So there's a few slides of explanation here. But first we're going to start with some terminology. There's a common noun. A common noun is a noun that refers to a generic person, place, or thing, like a park, a teacher, or a standardized test. Then there's a proper noun, which is a noun that refers to a specific person, place, or thing, like Disneyland, a specific park, Miss Appleton, a specific teacher, and the SAT, everyone's favorite standardized test. Then a possessive pronoun. This is a pronoun that indicates possession. Who would have guessed? And finally, an article. An article is technically a word that directly precedes a noun, comes right before a noun, and clarifies the noun's specificity. We just defined two categories of nouns based on specificity, common or proper, and an article is a word that clarifies whether a noun is specific or general. And in English, as I said, there's only three, a, an, and the. But despite the fact that there's only three, where exactly you can use these three is a little bit complex. So our first set of rules. Different categories or types of nouns have different requirements when it comes to articles. The first category, A here, is singular common nouns, and these nouns must use articles. It's not optional. I can't say, for example, James walked to park. No, you have to add a. James walked to a park, or the. James walked to the park, because park is a singular common noun. This is sort of just something that students have to memorize about English. And I've noticed over the years that this is a common mistake, especially for non-native English speakers, to just say James walked to park and think that that's fine because it has a subject and a verb and an object, and it sounds like it should be fine, but because it's a singular common noun, you have to put an article in front of it in English. Okay, that's the first class. The second class or category of nouns is plural common nouns. And these may use articles. It's optional. You could say, James walks to parks. There's no article and it's just fine. Or you could say, James walks to the parks. It's also fine. So these are flexible. Then category C is proper nouns. And these may not use articles. For example, if we're talking about Disneyland as a specific park, you can't say James walked to the Disneyland. It's not grammatically correct. And finally, category D are nouns that are preceded by a possessive pronoun. Whoa, that's a lot of P words in a row. Preceded, so a possessive pronoun is what we defined on this slide. It's a pronoun that indicates possession. And preceded means comes before. So if you have a noun and right before it there's a possessive pronoun, then you can't use an article. So you can't say James walks to my park. That doesn't make any, well, just assume that I own a park. You can't say James walks to my park. You can say James walks to the park, you can say James walks to my park, but you can't have both a possessive pronoun and an article. In English, when you have a possessive pronoun, it takes the place of the article, and so if you add an article, it's sort of like two articles, which you can't. Wow, that was a lot of rules. Guess what? There's even more rules. Not only are there categories of nouns governing when you can use articles, but for these two types of nouns that can use articles, they can only use specific articles. So first, a singular common generic noun, singular common generic, uses a or an. Like, James walks to a park. That's just some park, it's singular, it's a common noun, and it's generic. It's not talking about some specific park no, it's just some random park, James walked to a park. And if you have a consonant, use a, vowel, an. All other nouns use the. So if you have a plural, if you have something that doesn't conform to any of these, if you have a noun that's plural, or that's proper, or that's specific, it uses the. Like if you want to talk about James walking to a specific park, you say James walks to the park. That's still singular, that's still common, but it's specific, and so it needs the word the. And again, proper nouns don't use any articles, but plural nouns would use the. Cool. So that's a lot of rules. That's why these slides are purple. It's a lot to learn for like one question on the SAT. But if you don't follow these rules, you will destroy a grammar. So here we have some examples. Let's walk through them one by one. First, over spring break, I'm going to the New York with my friends. Well, that doesn't work because New York is a proper noun and the is an article, and proper nouns can't have articles. Goodbye. Then down here, I see the different stray dog every time I walk to school. This one is tricky. It almost sounds correct, but remember that a noun that is singular, common, and generic should use the article a or an. It shouldn't use the. And here, different stray dog. That is singular, that is common, and it's also crucially generic. A different stray dog. That's just some random stray dog every day. It's not specific. And so you can't say I see the different stray dog. That doesn't make sense. The is a specific dog, and different implies that these are just random different dogs. So you need to have a instead. Then down here, did you see how much your plant grew? No. You can't have a possessive pronoun and an article together. And then down here, Jamie, let me let that disappear. Jamie gets bored when she goes to a museum. This is the mistake I was talking about that I see a lot with people who aren't native English speakers, because it looks right and sort of sounds right, but museum's a singular common noun. It needs an article, so we add a. Also, fun fact, if you look at these slides in edit mode, they look really messed up. And I spent like 5 or 10 minutes making them look this messed up so that they look good in this mode. So you should appreciate that. Let's move on. Back to the normal required non-purple material. Our final subtopic in this long element of agreement is comparisons. So first, comparisons part 1. Adjectives, this has to do with the forms of adjectives to use. Adjectives have 3 main forms: the positive, for when you have one noun, the comparative, for comparing 2 nouns, and the superlative, for comparing 3 or more nouns. And the rule is most of the time, for most adjectives, you just add er to make the adjective comparative and est to make the adjective superlative, like hungry, and then hungrier, and then hungriest. Great. But some adjectives in English are irregular. We're not going to go into a lot of depth about those. You don't need to know too many of them for the SAT, but I did assemble some common ones, like very common ones, so common that they're probably intuitive. Just in case, I assembled them onto this slide for students to look at. Worse you don't add an est and say worstest, it's just worst. Cool. So a practice question with this. Because I have a younger sibling, I am the oldest sibling. Well, that sort of sounds right, but think about those rules we went over in the last slide really carefully. It's not grammatically correct. We should change it to D. So oldest sibling. Well, oldest is the superlative, and that means we have to be comparing at least 3 things. But here we're only comparing 2, one younger sibling and a speaker. So oldest isn't appropriate, and because of that, I can also eliminate C. Then how do I choose between B and D? Well, you know it has to be the comparative, so we have that. They differ based on whether it's siblings or sibling. And something I should point out is that this question is doing something that a lot of SAT questions do, which is test on multiple grammatical rules combined. Like siblings and sibling, that's consistency in number, which we covered a number of slides ago, but I put it into this question to simulate real SAT questions, which, as you'll see, combine grammatical concepts in all sorts of weird ways. So I am the oldest sibling or siblings. Well, or I am, the older sibling or siblings. I is singular, siblings is plural, B doesn't work. You need to have D. So moving on. Comparisons part 2. There's more comparisons. Here we want to talk about between versus among. The rule is when you have 2 nouns and you're comparing them, you use the word between. When you have 3 or more nouns, use the words among or amongst. There's no difference between among or amongst. They're essentially the same. So another practice question. Lily was the fastest runner between the 4 cousins. What do you think? Here the right answer is C. Between. Between is for 2 nouns. 4 cousins. That's not 2, so we can't use between. So we can immediately eliminate both A and B. And then, should it be C or D? Fastest runner amongst. Fastest is the superlative for when there's 3 or more. Amongst is the form for when you're comparing 3 or more. This works. In D, faster is the comparative. That's for only 2 objects or people, and here we have 4, so D doesn't work. And this is sort of tricky. Amongst and among are the same thing, so you can't tell anything about the difference between C and D by looking at this. You have to look at fastest versus faster. All right, then comparisons part 3. Comparison saga continues with the difference between fewer, many, less, and much. Something that very often confuses students and teachers and even me sometimes. The rule is when you're comparing nouns that can be counted, you use the words fewer and many more. When you're comparing nouns that cannot be counted, you use the words or phrases less and much more. So, for example, if you're talking about water, water is not something that can be counted, so you can't say, I have fewer water, or I have many water, or many more water than you. You would say less and much. I have less water than you, I have much more water than you, something like that. And on the opposite side, if it's something that can be counted, like raindrops, you wouldn't say there are less raindrops or much more raindrops, even though that sounds like it should be correct. The grammatically correct thing is that there's fewer or many more raindrops, because those can be counted. And so again, a practice question. There are fewer stars in the sky tonight than there were yesterday night. What should we do here? Hey, remember how I said sometimes A is the right answer? Well, sometimes A is the right answer. Here, we just leave it as is. Fewer stars in the sky. Fewer stars is something that can be counted. Fewer is for countable objects, so this works. Less, that doesn't work because less is for things that cannot be counted. Much more doesn't work. Much more is for objects that cannot be counted. And if you delete the underlined portion, then you get there are stars in the night sky tonight than there were yesterday night. That doesn't make sense. You're like trying to compare something in this half of the sentence and not in this half. It just creates more problems. All right, we can now celebrate. We finished the very long element of agreement. As I said, that's the longest of any of these. And now we move on to element number 2. No, not element number 2. I don't know, this is 5 or whatever. The next element, which is style. What do I mean by style? Well, just like people can have style based on the clothes they wear or the way they do their hair, sentences can have style based on the punctuation they use to embellish themselves. So this rule, or this element, is about punctuation. The golden rule of punctuation. So this, I believe there is a way to sort of summarize and encompass all of the nitpicky sub-rules that students need to memorize about punctuation in this simple golden rule of punctuation. And it goes like this. 4, 3, 2, 1, ack. Okay, let's do it again. You should say it out loud with me. 4, 3, 2, 1, ack. That's the golden rule of punctuation. What this means is that there are 4 proper ways to use commas, 3 ways to use dashes, 2 ways to use colons, 1 way to use a semicolon, and ack, apostrophes and quotation marks are also a thing that you should know about. So this is everything you need to know about punctuation on the SAT. Now, of course, if you just memorize this rule, you're not going to get any of the punctuation questions correct because you need to actually know what the 3 rules for dashes are, for example. But this is a good mnemonic device, at least I find it useful, so that when you're solving a problem and you see a comma, you can think, well, what are the 4 ways of using commas? Oh yeah, there's this, and this, and oh, this doesn't conform to any of those, so I know that answer choice is wrong. So I think it can be useful in that way. I don't know. Maybe you find it useful, maybe you don't. Who knows? In any case, let's look now at commas. So commas have 4 common usages, as I said, and the first one is to separate elements in a list, as you probably know. For example, Claire made dinner using 2 red tomatoes, 4 green onions, a splash of white wine vinegar, and a pinch of salt. These are elements. This is a list. We put commas between them. Everyone's happy. Now, one note is that there's this age-old debate about Oxford commas and whether you should put a comma between the final 2 elements in a sentence, and the SAT is never going to test on that. For the purposes of this exam, both ways are grammatically correct. It doesn't matter. They could put a comma here or not, and the SAT will never make you choose between those 2 or anything like that. Then the second way to use commas is to offset a non-essential dependent clause in the middle of an independent clause. Wow, there's a lot of words there. Are they all really that important? In this case, yes, they are really that important. You need to remember the details of what's said here. You have to have an independent clause, and then within that, there has to be a dependent clause. Not another independent clause, a dependent clause, and it has to contain non-essential information, and only then can you separate it with commas. For example, if we look here, Amy, who had demanding tastes, refused to eat this meal. So let's look at this carefully. The outer clause is an independent clause. Amy refused to eat this meal. Okay, so that satisfies the first part of this definition. Then the inner part, who had demanding tastes, that's a dependent clause. That satisfies this. And then we can ask, is this non-essential information? And the way to think about that is, does this sentence still mean the same thing without this clause? So without it, it would be Amy refused to eat this meal. And with it, Amy, who had demanding tastes, refused to eat this meal. Yeah, the 2 basically mean the same thing. Like if you add this, it provides more detail, but it's not essential. So we satisfied all of our definitions. We can put commas to separate this non-essential dependent clause from the independent clause it is contained within. All right, 3. And actually I should make a little note here. You can see that I color-coded all of this. So when we do example 2, or when we do rule 2, when we do rule 2, then the 2 for the examples is highlighted, and look, even the commas are highlighted in green. Wow, spectacular. So now we're on to 3. Third way you can use a comma is to separate an independent clause from a dependent clause. Simple. Certainly simpler than number 2. And the order of these usually doesn't matter. You can have independent, then dependent, dependent, then independent, whatever. There's a usually here because there's a few edge cases where it does matter, but I'm not really even going to cover these on the slides, not even in purple slides, because they're so obscure that it's not really worth anyone's time to know about them, and the SAT will rarely test on something like that. So, an example, because she hated to see so much food go to waste, Arthi devoured Amy's leftovers. Dependent, independent, good. All right. And then the fourth way is actually something we already discussed. You should pause this video and think and see if you've been paying close attention and can remember what it is. So, what is it? Well, it's separate two independent clauses joined only by a coordinating conjunction. It's the thing we talked about back at the beginning of lesson 1 a week ago, when we talked about how to resolve run-on sentences and comma splices. You add a comma and a coordinating conjunction. And that's what this is saying. You can use a comma to separate two independent clauses if there's also a coordinating conjunction involved. So down here, Iris was impressed by Arthi, so Amy unfollowed Iris on Instagram. Here we have an independent clause, then we have, starting with Amy, another independent clause. There's a so between them, we add a comma, and everybody is happy and content. And if these sentences seem sort of random, you should read them one after another and watch the grammatic narrative that unfolds. Next, dashes. So dashes have 3 common usages. The golden rule was for 3. 3 is for dashes. First way we can use a dash is to announce a list. So here, number 1, I want you to buy a few things. 18 monkeys, 25 tubas, and 17,000 pounds of butter. It's a really weird list, but it's a list, and I'm offsetting it from the rest of the sentence, so I can use a dash. Second way I can use a dash is to separate two clauses, independent or dependent, okay, where the second clause elaborates on information introduced in the first. The key crucial part of this is the second half. The second clause has to elaborate on info introduced in the first clause. For example, she gave me exactly what she promised. Hope. Now, this is an independent clause, and this is just a word, but that doesn't matter. This could be dependent or independent or whatever. The important thing is that the second part of this sentence elaborates on the first. She gave me exactly what she promised. You're wondering, what is that? Hope. It elaborates. Okay, then number 3, third and final way to use a dash is to offset non-essential independent or dependent clauses in the middle of an independent clause. Again, the nitpicky details are important. This is an independent or dependent clause. Now, when we talked about commas, we said you could only offset a dependent clause. Here, it can be independent or dependent, and it still has to be non-essential. Down here, the asterisk, as you'll read when this black square fades, just says what I just said. It's a difference from commas. This seems like really nitpicky and like a lot to remember, and it is, but it shows up often enough on the SAT that I decided it was not really purple slide material. This is material that all students should know. You don't have to dwell on this in class, but just remind students to review these slides, look at them when they're solving problems, and over time they'll internalize these rules, nitpicky as they are. So here, they needed to get home. The sun was beginning to set, but their sense of adventure pushed them forward. Well, here we have an independent clause. They needed to get home, but their sense of adventure pushed them forward. And then inside it, we have another independent clause. The sun was beginning to set, so we couldn't use commas here. It would have to be dependent, but we can use dashes. And the last thing we have to check is this non-essential information? So they needed to get home, but their sense of adventure pushed them forward, or they needed to get home, the sun was beginning to set, but their sense of adventure, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, this is non-essential. The sentence reads the same either way. This just provides a little more information about why they needed to get home. So non-essential, dashes were cool. Colons. There are two ways to use colons. First way is announce a list. For example, the following students will be mentioned in this sentence: Zach, Naren, and Ethan. Wow, recursion. Second, you can separate two clauses, independent or dependent, where the first clause elaborates on information introduced, where the second clause elaborates on information introduced in the first. This probably sounds vaguely familiar. It is vaguely familiar. These two ways of using colons are the same as the first two ways of using dashes. So that's less information that you have to remember and that students have to remember. If you know the three ways of using dashes, just remember that the first two are also the ways you can use colons. They're exactly the same. And that's what this little note here says. So if we look here, Tom got exactly what he deserved, an honorable mention in this very sentence. We have a second clause that elaborates on the first. All right, semicolons. So remember the golden rule. There's 4 ways to use commas, 3 ways to use dashes, 2 ways to use colons, and only one way to use semicolons. This is simple. Just one thing to remember. You use semicolons to separate a pair of independent clauses. There's a little note here that you can read on your own time. It's not that important, but there's one way to use a semicolon, separate a pair of independent clauses. Now, if you've studied grammar in depth, you would know that there's, in English, technically a few other ways you can use semicolons, but the SAT doesn't test on them. So for our purposes, there's one way and only one way. For example, Ernie felt sad and mad. He also felt a tad glad. Independent clause, semicolon. Great. We've been looking at a lot of rules, and so now let's get some practice at using them in the context of SAT-style questions. Practice question number 1. People who pursue People who pursue careers in transportation planning have a wide variety of educational backgrounds. What do you think the correct answer is? Here it happens to be A, no change. Let's go through why the other answers are incorrect. B, people who pursue careers in educational planning. So what you want to think are, what are the 4 correct ways of using commas, and is this one of them? Well, is this something to do with a list? No. Is this separating an independent and dependent clause? There's 2 commas. No. Does this have something to do with coordinating conjunctions? No. This is maybe the separating a dependent clause in the middle of an independent clause. People have a wide variety, and then who. Okay, that seems to conform, but remember that it has to be a non-essential dependent clause. And if we read this without this part that's within the commas, people have a wide variety of educational backgrounds. And then if we add it, people who pursue careers in transportation planning have a wide variety of educational backgrounds. That's not non-essential information. That completely changes the meaning of the sentence, so we can't use commas to offset this. Okay, that's why B is wrong. Then C, people who pursue careers in transportation planning, again, we're trying to offset information. This is not non-essential information. Without it, the sentence doesn't make sense. Can't do it. And then finally down here, people who pursue careers in transportation planning, comma, have a wide variety. Okay, so what are we trying to do here? Maybe we're trying to separate independent and dependent clauses, but the second thing, have a wide variety, that's not even a dependent clause. That's just a fragment of a sentence. That doesn't work at all. So none of these conform to the 4 acceptable usages of commas. They're all wrong, and A is just fine. Practice question number 2. The name Kingman was selected for its 2 parts, king and man. Cantonese for scenery and composition. Okay, we got commas, semicolons, colons, all sorts of things going on here. Let's look at what's happening. Well, actually, first I'll tell you that B is right, and now let's go through why. What I want to first ask is, can I use a comma like this? If I'm thinking about A, no change. The name Kingman was selected for its 2 parts, comma, king and man. Well, this is not separating elements in a list. It certainly doesn't involve coordinating conjunctions. This is not offsetting information because there's only 1 comma, and this is not separating a dependent and independent clause. King and man is a couple of words, not a clause. This doesn't work. I can't use a comma here. Right away I can eliminate it. Then let's look at C. Okay, C has a semicolon over here. Now I told you the only way you can use a semicolon is to separate independent clauses. The name Kingman was selected for its 2 parts, king and man. Well, that's an independent clause. Cantonese for scenery and composition. No, that sentence does not contain a verb. It's not an independent clause. You can't use a semicolon here to separate the 2. So C is wrong. For similar reasons, D is also wrong. And we get that the only correct one is B. Can I use a colon? Well, yeah, I'm announcing a list, king and man, so colon is fine. Can I put a comma over here? Well, yeah, I can put a comma there. The name Kingman was selected for its 2 parts, king and man, comma, Cantonese for scenery and composition. I'm separating an independent clause from a dependent clause. So this works on all of those. Then practice question 3. A long sentence that I took from an actual SAT. Her fine brushwork conveys detailed street-level activity. A peanut vendor pushing his cart on the sidewalk. A pigeon pecking for crumbs around a fire hydrant. And an old man tending to a baby outside a doorway. And here the correct answer is A. No change. So let's go through all of these. First, if we have a comma, well, that's fine, because I'm separating elements in a list. Okay, A works out. If I have a dash, I can only use dashes to announce a list or introduce information that elaborates on previous information. We're doing neither of those here, so the dash is out. I can only use a colon the same way I can use a dash, so the colon's out, and hydrant with nothing. Well, then I have a pigeon pecking for crumbs around a fire hydrant, an old man tending to a baby outside a doorway. Now it's a run-on sentence with 2 independent clauses smashed together. No. So all these are wrong. A is right. And yeah, that's how it goes. So next, apostrophes. Another of these purple slide topics, because it doesn't show up that often, and students have already learned commas and colons and semicolons and dashes, which show up more often, and if you add this to the mix, it's just going to get overwhelming. But I will go through it here. So, apostrophes are used to do 2 things. The first one is form contractions. Words that are combinations of other words. The rule is that the apostrophe goes between the original 2 words, and some letters get eliminated. So let's look. Bad example. We can't buy tickets to see Finding Nemo on ice, and we're very mad about it. This is not good. Can't is missing an apostrophe, and I don't know what this thing over here is. So can't does not equal can plus not. Apostrophe is supposed to separate the two words. It's not doing that. We're, however that's pronounced, is not this bad. A good way is we can't buy tickets to Finding Nemo on ice, and we're very mad about it. Can't is a combination of can plus not with certain letters eliminated, and we're is we plus are with certain letters eliminated. So that's the first way to use apostrophes. Now the other one that's trickier, and the SAT is more likely going to test students on, is that you can use apostrophes to indicate possession or ownership, usually of one noun over another. So you say Skylar's pencil. It's a pencil that belongs to Skylar. Skylar has possession or ownership over the pencil. Now for most nouns, you just add an apostrophe and then an S. Student goes to students, the student's pencil. But for plural nouns ending in S, you only add an apostrophe. Technically, you could also add another S, but that's unnecessary. You can just add an apostrophe and it's fine. So students versus students, and you can say students' pencils. Okay, an example. So first, a bad example. The magicians scared the musicians and stole all of the musicians' instruments. Why is this bad? Because look, magicians is plural and musicians is plural, and they stole all of the plural musicians' instruments, but here I'm adding an apostrophe as though musician is singular. So this is creating some disagreement and it's not good. It's plural, it's singular, doesn't work. Now the way I can fix it is to make both of these plural. So instead of adding the apostrophe before the S, I add the apostrophe after the S. And now the reader clearly knows that musicians is plural and that the magicians stole all of the musicians' instruments. I guess they were trying to do some sort of musical magic trick. So that's apostrophes. And the very last punctuation subtopic is quotes. Now quotes rarely show up on the SAT, but they could, so I wanted to include them. Quotes, as you probably know, are indicated to designate are used to designate or indicate that someone's speaking or thinking. Usage is guided by a few simple rules. You put a quote when someone starts speaking. You put a quote when someone finishes speaking. And thirdly, and crucially, periods and commas should always be placed inside the final set of quotation marks. Inside, not outside. Many of us, maybe even some of you, when you're writing, often put the punctuation outside the quotation marks, and sometimes I'm tempted to do this too, but that's not grammatically correct. In modern English, the punctuation always goes inside the quotes. It looks weird, but it's grammatically correct. So a bad example is, although Jimmy called the refuge majestic, and you know that article about caribou, I wasn't impressed. No, this punctuation is outside the quotes. This is terrible. Let's put it inside the quotes, and then we'll all be happy. And finally, an extra note about quotes. Sometimes quotation marks are used to indicate sarcasm or to demark the title of a minor artistic work. But this probably won't show up on the SAT. I've never seen it, but technically they could ask about it because it's like English grammar, and technically they can ask whatever they want. So, I don't know. It's here, but probably won't show up. Cool. So, as a reminder, again, let's say this together. What's the golden rule of punctuation? It's 4, 3, 2, 1, hack. Good. That's the end of this video. I'll see you with part